Welcome to Apologetics 101, and I'm your host, Christian apologist, Brian Keith Bowen. Well, um, there won't be no PowerPoint presentation today. Today is just going to be me speaking to you, and I'm going to be continuing my open-ended series of the arguments of Matt Dillahunty. Again, this is no personal attack against Matt Dillahunty. I'm not, this isn't picking on Matt Dillahunty Day or something. Rather, because of his popularity and reach, and because of the kind of influence he has, and because of the kind of arguments and he has good rhetorical ability, and he does a lot of debates. He's in the public eye a lot. He's one of the main hosts of the Atheist Experience, and a show out of Austin, Texas. And like I said, he does a lot of debates, and he has really good rhetorical ability. And sometimes it's hard to really get past someone's really good rhetorical ability to get at the arguments underneath. I've got good rhetorical ability, but the idea is to evaluate the arguments that are being presented. And so Matt Dillahunty has a lot of bad arguments, and so I feel compelled to actually evaluate those arguments and be able to bring you and show you where errors lie in his arguments. Now, today we're going to be talking about the unsound epistemology of Matt Dillahunty. Now, I think a lot of his bad arguments, anything from what we talked about last week, claims not evidence, to his I don't know assertions and his standard of evidence and his all these things stream from his bad epistemology. And this is not just me talking, okay? This is not just my opinion. It's not just a Brian Bowen original or something. No, everyone seems to think that when they evaluate his arguments, that it really comes down to his bad epistemology. This is not just something that I'm saying, okay? I'm not telling you something that if you're already an apologist, if you've already evaluated his arguments, if you've already seen his debates, you know what I'm talking about. Everyone says it comes down to his epistemology. All right, and it does. His epistemology is set up in such a way that the resurrection, it can't pass. It can't pass. All right. Let's start with I got some notes here. I've only got like 5 points written down, but before you think this is gonna be a short video, each one of these points has got some in-depth discussion to make on it. So, all right, let's talk about Matt's view on absolute certainty. Matt has this view that he thinks that nothing can be proven absolute. He doesn't even think this is absolute certainty is what they call Cartesian certainty. He doesn't even think that his own existence can be absolutely certain of. Now, of course, the statement that nothing can be proven absolute or nothing can be that there is no such thing as an absolute is a self-refuting argument, actually. Because you're stating an absolute and you claim nothing can be proven absolute, then can you be absolutely sure about what you cannot know absolutely? Well, if the person being as consistent as possible, he would say, no, you can't. You can't assert that absolutely because you're making an absolute statement and discussing absolutes, and you're saying that you're denying absolutes, but you're making an absolute to deny an absolute. You see what I'm saying? So it becomes a self-refuting argument. But there can be absolutes. I mean, for example, we know there's no married bachelors. They're because they're logically inconsistent, and we know that there's no such thing as a square circle. I mean, we can be absolute about things, and of course, you don't really need absolute certainty to have a high degree of reasonable assurance that something is true. And to some degree, I think Matt agrees with that. To some degree. All right. But he doesn't think there can be any absolutes. Now, this is the first half of epistemology, but the second half of epistemology appears to want to believe that something has to be absolutely proven in order to believe it is true. His epistemology is actually set up so that no matter what, no amount of evidence could ever prove wrong. I mean, basically, he wants the supernatural proven to him first, so he has to assume his conclusion. Um, he thinks that he has to assume naturalism, and he applies methodological naturalism, and 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 of course, if you present evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, that becomes the evidence of the supernatural, because if Jesus rose again from the dead, that certainly would prove the supernatural. But then he rejects that in favor of his worldview because the evidence supports a conclusion he doesn't support. And he sets his worldview up in a way, or sets his epistemology up in a way that he rejects. He rejects miracles. He rejects any evidence that would support these kinds of things, because this is the way he sets his epistemology up. Now, in getting prepared for this video, I watched a lot of Matt Dillahunty's debates. I watched some of the old debates that I've known. Watched some new ones. I watched some. Actually, there was a debate review by Braxton Hunter from Trinity Radio on YouTube. And normally I watch the debate first, but I end up watching the debate review because it says why Matt Dillahunty won't believe in God. And basically it was very centered around, it was a debate review that Braxton Hunter did, but it was very centered around Matt Dillahunty's epistemology. And I thought that Braxton Hunter actually did a very, very good job. Which actually leads us into the next point. Matt's epistemological framework. His epistemology is actually set up so Matt Dillahunty cannot be convinced. He cannot be convinced. Now, Braxton Hunter said some similar stuff, very similar stuff, in that debate review that I myself have said about Matt Dillahunty arguments straight from the beginning. And it's weird. My last debate review that I did between Jonathan McClatchy and Matt Dillahunty on Modern Day Debate, and I did a debate review of that, and it's on my channel. And in that debate review, I said that, and I said, like if Matt's watching this video, and again, if he's watching this review of his epistemology, and I said, so Matt, what if God knows exactly what will convince you? Because he thinks that, in his mind, he thinks that okay, if you ask him what would convince him of a miracle, he says he doesn't know what will convince him. He thinks he will know it when he sees it, but he doesn't know what it would be. He can't give you an explanation and of what would convince him. And in a minute, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, because this falls into a principle called the principle of falsification, and we'll get into that in a minute. But he doesn't have anything that he knows that would falsify it. Now, the way he tries to get out of this is by saying, well, God would know what would convince me. And so if God came down and talked to me, of course, even if God came down and communicated to Matt audibly and visibly, it wouldn't matter, because Matt would always figure out some way of trying to get around it, like I'm hallucinating, Matt Dillahunty often, who I think about whenever I tell people about what I call the Ebenezer Scrooge approach, where Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by three ghosts and Marley, and when he was visited by Marley, he said that maybe that's that piece of corn I ate today. Maybe that's the reason why I'm seeing this ghost here. In other words, you'll always come up with some kind of excuse um, if you don't want to go with the evidence. And so even if God did do that, he would still not believe. And he said in his debate with Braxton Hunter that even if God would to do that and reveal himself, he still wouldn't worship him. So I mean, he expects God to reveal himself to him, but yeah, he wouldn't worship him even if he did. So I mean, and that's because of things. But the thing I said in that last debate review, I thought was really profound, and it turned out that apparently uh, 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 Braxton Hunter said something similar to that in this debate review that I watched about why won't he accept the existence of God, and Matt Dillahunty, and and he said, or I said in my debate review, I said that I said, Matt, what if God knows exactly what would convince you, and it's nothing? What if he said nothing will convince you? And Braxton said something similar. He said, what if there isn't anything to convince you? I mean, after all, I mean, you don't think, even if it's, that God or the meteorite shots at the moon, when the dust settles, there's a message on it, you still wouldn't believe. Someone's head cut off, you still wouldn't believe. Someone parted the ocean in the name of Jesus, you still wouldn't believe. So, I mean, if all these things, these are examples that were actually given to Matt in debates, and he said he still wouldn't believe that something supernatural would happen. I mean, how much more evidence would it take to convince you? And you saying, "Oh, well, God talking to me would." No, it wouldn't. No, it wouldn't. No, it wouldn't. Because you could always come up with something. Now, the principle of falsification is when you can show that your worldview is falsifiable. It doesn't mean it's false. It just means it can be. There's something that can be able to prove it false or true or false. If your worldview is subjective, then I mean it's a useless worldview. And if your worldview cannot be falsified, see, if you ask a Christian what would prove Christianity wrong, we can give you examples of what would prove Christianity wrong. We can give you examples. Things like finding the body of Jesus is often a common example that gets brought up would prove Christianity wrong, because that would disprove the resurrection, which is the foundational doctrine of Christianity. We can give you things that would prove Christianity wrong. But when you ask Matt what would prove him wrong, he can't come up with anything. You have to be able to allow falsification. Now, in that debate review that I did, or more specifically in the debate, I didn't really cover Jonathan McClatchy's response to Matt Dillahunty's opening case, which is why I think he actually said this. But Jonathan had challenged Matt's epistemology and said that, or challenged his view, where he doesn't know what would convince him, and he said, well, if you don't know what would convince you, then I wonder if your view is really even an evidential view, and Matt laughed in the background, and of course he can't respond at that point because Jonathan's doing his rebuttal session, but he laughed in the background though of that, and he responds next time and thinks that's a low crud, and it's not, because it's true, because you're not really basing it on evidence. But the point is that really your worldview has to be falsifiable. A good worldview has to be falsifiable. I have to have a way of knowing whether or not if it's false. I can't find out if what your view is false because you don't even know what would convince you that it's false. You don't even know. You don't know what would convince you it's true, and you don't know what would convince you false. That's not a good epistemology at all. What would convince Matt Dillahunty? He says nothing. Or he says he doesn't know. He does say he's open to evidence, but I've seen quite a bit of Matt's debates, and I am absolutely convinced this is a man who's not open to evidence. I don't care what he says. I don't care how convinced he is that he's open to evidence. At the end of the day, he is not open to evidence at all. He's extremely closed-minded. He's hyper skeptical. He sets his epistemology up in a way that nothing can pass nothing can convince him unless Matt Dillahunty wants to be convinced. It's the way his epistemology is set up. It's not set up to be able to accept evidence. It's set up so it does not accept evidence. It's actually set up to deny evidence. Which leads us to the Matt standard of evidence. Matt's standard of evidence is completely unreasonable. When I did that debate review, the debate between Matt Dillahunty and Jonathan McClatchy, you see the kind of evidences he wanted to take. He wanted to take things like blood work and DNA evidence and physical evidence, and he wanted all this for historical figure and events. And we have very little physical evidence from history. We have, assuming that he's referring to archaeology, but he's not just referring to archaeology because he's talking about DNA evidence and things like that. You ain't gonna get DNA evidence from a historical figure. But those are the kind of standards he has. These are unreasonable standards of evidence. I mean, they would probably be more reasonable in our modern culture where we're trying to investigate a crime and we want to know beyond a shadow of doubt or something of that nature, so I can stand up in court because of the way our court system is. But for a past event and a past situation, a past person in history, you're not going to get DNA evidence and you're not going to get blood work. I've even heard him say that he liked the spear thrust that was thrust in Jesus' side because he says he doesn't trust testimony. But the reality of it is that historical testimony counts as evidence, and it can be considered strong evidence in the eyes of the historian, depending on the nature of the testimony. And we dealt with his argument of claims not evidence last week. I'm not going to go over that again this time around because I've got the previous video of the series, the first video of the series, has that in there where we discuss his claims not evidence argument. But Matt's standard of evidence is completely unreasonable. Like I said, he sets it up where the resurrection, miracles, supernatural, God can never pass this criteria. He sets it up that way. He sets it up to fail immediately. And then he blames it on God. He said, you know whose fault it is? It's God, because he couldn't give me better evidence. No, it's Matt Dillahunty's fault. Matt is responsible. Matt Dillahunty, listen to me. Matt Dillahunty is responsible for not believing, not God. Because his standard of evidence is unreasonable. His epistemology is unsound. He sets his epistemology up in such a way that he will not accept. He will not accept evidence. He'll say he will, but he won't. He'll reject it because the evidence points to a conclusion that doesn't fit his worldview. Matt also has a need to psychoanalyze God. You can't psychoanalyze a divine being. It's just not possible. One thing, the mind of a divine being would be way beyond what we can know. But it's hard enough to psychoanalyze someone in front of you to begin with, and you know that person. To psychoanalyze a God you don't know, that you don't believe in, that you have no personal relationship with, and expect to psychoanalyze him. This is what I would do if I was God. Listen, I know we often say, if I was Matt Dillahunty, this is what I would do. The reality is you're not Matt Dillahunty. The reality is you're not Brian Bowen. Okay, so if you're not that person, there's no full way of knowing what that person would do. I mean, how could you? There's no way to know because that you're not that person. You don't have that person's experiences. You don't have that person's knowledge. You don't have that person's the kind of stuff that he knows, the kind of things that he's informed of. You don't have those things. You don't have his experiences. You don't have his opinions and ideas. You don't have his mind. How do you know what you would do if you were that person? You don't know. So how would you know what to do if you were God? You don't know God. I mean, if you're an atheist, you have no personal relationship with him. You don't believe in him, but yet you're trying to psychoanalyze him, and he does that. He psychoanalyzes God. Well, if God really wants me to believe, he'll come down here and reveal himself to me. As if you can really know what he would do in that situation. And Matt himself, in his debate with Braxton Hunter, admit that even if God did reveal himself to him, he wouldn't worship him. He wouldn't worship him even then. What about Matt's use of "I don't know"? He does this a lot in his debates. He'll say, "I don't know." Okay, let me explain something about "I don't know" first. Okay, if a person genuinely don't know, I don't know is okay. Don't come up with one of the pet peeves of mine is when someone comes up with a idea of what's true off the top of their heads, and instead of just saying I don't know because they really didn't know. Now, when you have information, when we have data, when we have evidence, you can't say I don't know. I don't know only becomes the honest response when you really don't know and there's no evidence and there's no data and we don't have nothing to talk about regarding it. We say, okay, then I don't know. I don't know how to account for it because I don't have data to help me here. But when you are faced with a situation, in which you have data, you have information, then it would not be the honest approach to say I don't know. Especially when the person saying I don't know is just doing it because he is being pushed into a corner he can't get out of with his worldview and having to explain a fundamental aspect that cannot be explained by his worldview. Let me tell you something else about worldviews. Your worldview, a good worldview, has to possess explanatory scope and explanatory power. What does those terms mean? Explanatory scope is when you explain more of the data. Explanatory power is when you explain the data very well. And Matt's worldview doesn't appear to have very good explanatory scope or explanatory power. It doesn't have explanatory scope because he winds up with I don't knows a lot. It doesn't really explain a lot of the data. And when you ask fundamental questions to those worldview, the responses you get is I don't know. I don't know. That tells me you don't have that explanatory power or explanatory scope or power. because it does, because what it does, you do try to explain, doesn't explain the data very well. And if Matt's saying, if I don't know, it's become your mantra, then that tells me that you don't have very good explaining skills. If I don't know, it's become your mantra. It also is becoming a cop out. That's what they call that. Whenever you try to use I don't know as an excuse, it becomes a cop out. A cop out is when you basically are using something as an excuse to justify not having to account for it, deal with it, explain it, etc. And when you're being backed up into a corner rhetorically in a debate where you have to really take account, your worldview is being put on trial and you're having to take account of something, and your response when you're asked these fundamental questions is, I don't know, then that means I don't know is being used as a cop out. A cop out. What's that called? And I don't believe I don't know should be used as a cop out. There are genuine situations where you can use I don't know. And you should use I don't know in those situations. But when it comes to data, if we have information, but that information, that evidence doesn't support your position, and you say, I don't know. I've been following Matt Dillahunty for a while. I've been watching his debates. I've watched some reviews that he's done even. I've watched other people do debate reviews on his debate, which is far more plentiful. His debate reviews don't have any clips or nothing in it. They're usually him talking. But I really try to understand Matt's epistemology and his epistemological framework and the way he sets things up. And I just become convinced that Matt Dillahunty he's got a bad, unsound epistemology. And his epistemology is set up so no matter what, the resurrection, supernatural, the existing God would all fail. Because he doesn't want to believe those things, so they will all fail. He assumes his worldview, so they will all fail. And in doing so, he dismisses the evidence that's being presented to him because he don't want to believe. If Matt Dillahunty does not want to be convinced of something, he will not be convinced of it. And it's not God's fault. That's not God's fault. The evidence is there. The evidence is extremely strong. It's powerful enough to convince some of the hardcore skeptics, like yourself, Matt, that this is true. The evidence is there. It's very strong. If you didn't ignore the evidence, if you didn't dismiss the evidence, then maybe you can give an honest evaluation of the evidence. But he's just rejecting it outright, out of hand, rejecting it. And then he blames God. It's God's fault. Not giving better evidence. No, it's Matt's fault for having such a bad epistemology. Now, understand something. Matt gets really mad when people attack his epistemology and his philosophical reasoning. Those things he gets mad about. And I'm one of those people that will attack your philosophical reasoning and bad epistemology and so forth. Because it's just the way I am. I evaluate arguments. I don't like deceptive, misleading type arguments. And so when someone presents an argument and they try to hide their bad arguments with their good rhetorical ability, I'm going to say something about it. I'm going to say something about that argument. I'm going to say something about the fallacies you're committing in that argument. I'm not going to sugarcoat it because I don't think it's going to do you any good if I sugarcoat it. I don't think it's going to do anyone else any good if I sugarcoat it. Now, this does not mean that I am going out of my way to try to make you mad now. That's not my goal. That's not my purpose. If you do get mad about it, I'm not going to be too concerned with that because I'm more truth oriented. I'm about the truth. I don't care if the truth makes you mad. That's not my concern. Now that doesn't mean I want you to get mad. It just simply means that if you do get mad because of it, that don't mean I'm suddenly going to stop and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to talk about this stuff." Yes, I did, because it needs to be talked about. Because at the end of the day, when your epistemology is set up so that no matter what, you would reject the evidence and refuse the conclusion because Matt Dillahunty doesn't want to be convinced, then I mean, what can you say? It is a bad epistemology. It is unsound epistemology. It is a unstable epistemology. It's an epistemology based on very shaky grounds. That's why when backed into a corner, he gets mad. He says, "I don't know," and he can't explain the data because the data supports a position that he doesn't agree with. And his epistemology can't help him because it's set up so that nothing can convince him. And then he blames God because Matt Dillahunty isn't convinced. Matt Dillahunty isn't convinced because of Matt Dillahunty. And Matt Dillahunty, and only Matt Dillahunty, is responsible for why he's not convinced. God has nothing to do with this. God gave us the evidence, and the evidence is really, really strong. But Matt says, nope, I'm not going to believe, no matter what. I'm not going to believe testimonies. I'm not going to believe early creedal traditions. I'm not going to believe evidence of coming out of science of God's existence. I'm not going to believe any of those things. I'm not going to believe any of them. I'm going to reject all of it, or I'm going to just dismiss it or ignore it entirely. And then I'm going to blame God because I'm not convinced. Well, it doesn't matter if you're not convinced of that. I didn't write this in my notes, but that's another issue to his epistemology. Because he seems to think that somehow he's the arbitrary of what's true or not. He's not convinced. It must not be true, or the evidence must not be good enough to convince him it's true. But it is. If he would allow himself to actually look at the evidence instead of ignoring it and dismissing it, it is very good. But he just dismisses it. Like I said, last week we talked about Matt's claims not evidence argument, or in that debate, or in that review of that argument that he makes. He doesn't think that any testimony should count as evidence, and therefore he dismisses all testimony as evidence. And if he's willing to admit it's evidence at all, then he doesn't think that should rise to the level of convincing us of something, especially the supernatural, because he has his worldview on his sleeve, and that's that. That's sad. It really is. And if Matt don't like what I'm saying, I get that. All I can say to him is change your epistemology. Change your standards of evidence. Realize that you're dealing with a historical event, not a forensics report. So you don't need DNA evidence. You don't need fingerprints. You don't need blood work. We don't need physical evidence. In fact, the vast majority of what we know from history comes from testimonies. I said that the last time, I think. But it comes from testimonies. That's how we know anything. And really and truthfully, that's really how we know most things. The vast majority of our knowledge comes from somewhere else, other people. Because if you think about all the things that we know, only a small scope of it has to do with our own personal experience of seeing it, observing it, and knowing it because we've seen it and heard it and observed it. So a very small percentage of that, a fraction, a very tiny fraction. The rest of what we know comes from what other people have told us, either what we've read or what other people have said to us. So we get the vast majority of what we know from testimony, ultimately, from what other people themselves have either studied or seen or observed. Can we reject almost everything that they said to us? If we follow Matt's epistemology consistently, and if Matt followed it consistently, then yeah, we would have to. Anyway, I just figured that, if I'm going to do a series, open-ended or not, about Matt's arguments, I have to deal with his epistemology. That's going to be one. I knew that was going to be one of the first videos I did. It turned out to be the second in this series. And again, this series is open-ended. There won't be a specific end per se. I'm just going to be adding videos under that banner every time I deal with a specific area of his arguments. I don't know how many videos I'm in. For all I know, this, I might have only 2 videos, or I might have 10, or I might have 20. I don't know. I just want to keep the ending open in case I add a new video relating to his bad argumentation that he does in his debates. And I sure hope you liked this video. I know it wasn't as long as it normally is, and it didn't have the PowerPoint presentations and stuff. I didn't feel like we really needed the PowerPoint. I just wanted to be able to discuss Matt's unsound epistemology, because I think a lot of his bad argumentation does come from his epistemology. It comes from the way he sets his epistemology up. Now, Matt, in some sense, might actually agree with that. In some sense, that his arguments come from his epistemology. The problem, however, is that he thinks nothing's wrong with his epistemology. And it is. And that's why his arguments suffer because of it. Because his epistemology is really bad. And if you don't know what epistemology is, I probably should have said this at the beginning. I just realized that not everybody knows what the word epistemology actually means. It's basically a study of truth, or study of knowledge. And that's basically what it is. So anytime you study in truth claims and things like that, it basically has to do with epistemology. And when we talk about a person's personal epistemology, we're talking about their ability to know what's true and what's false, and be able to look at standards of evidence and things of that nature. And so that's the reason why a lot of Matt's arguments are streaming from his terrible epistemology. And I hate to say that. I really do. I wish his epistemology was better, but it's not. It is set up so no matter what, the resurrection, the existence of God, anything doing with what is considered supernatural, it's set up so that it would reject it, dismiss it completely, dismiss the evidence, dismiss the arguments without rhyme or reason, and have your worldview tied tightly to your sleeve. Now that's just no way to deal with truth. That's no way to evaluate truth. And so his epistemology is highly unstable, very shaky grounds, has no explanatory scope of power, uses I don't know as a cop-out, and then he blames God because he's not convinced. But Matt Dillahunty is not the arbitrator of truth. The fact that you're not convinced doesn't make it not true, and it doesn't make the arguments not strong. So I want everybody to keep that in mind. I want you to please be able to like and subscribe the video below. Leave a comment in the comment section. I would love to hear from you. Hit that notification bell because I'm making new videos all the time. I may be doing another video this week before the end of this week, or by Saturday, possibly. I'm not gonna guarantee that. Okay, I kind of was late on this video coming out, so it might be by Sunday or Monday or something. but there was a possibility that I might be doing another video. But hit the notification bell. It gives you alerts. Make sure you like the video. That helps with the YouTube algorithm, gets this information out there. And I want this information to get out there. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel, please. I'm posting all the time, and I do anything apologetic related, scholarly related, anything to do debate reviews, that deal with the scope of this channel and so forth. And let me know what you think in the comments. Like I said, I would love to hear from you. All right. Well, this has been a good one. It really has. As usual, always learn the facts. The critics don't want you to know. This is Brian Bowen signing off.